जिंदगी का सफर है ये
So welcome
कैसा
everyone
सफर
to our second session
कोई
on Vedic culture. In this unit,
समझाए
we'll be exploring Vedic
कोई
mythology, which is all the
जाने
different gods and goddesses of the Vedic pantheon, the stories about them, and what they might have meant to ancient Vedic communities. We'll also be walking through some of the more interesting myths that are found in the earliest Hindu text that we have, which is called the Rigveda Samhita. Now, I have to warn you before we go any further that the Vedic the Vedic mythology is kind of mind boggling, and the poetry that we'll encounter is really obscure. It's hard to understand, it's hard to figure out. Part of it is because it's so old, the language of it is really old, and we don't know a lot of what the words mean. But also part of it is that the poetry is supposed to be obscure. The Vedic rishis, the kind of creators of these verses, were trying to mess with how we distinguish between the real world and the world that we have to imagine, the other world. The whole point of myth is to be able to merge or fuse these two worlds together so that we can have better control both over the real world around us and the other world that's above us. So it's okay if you feel confused. It's what everyone was supposed to be feeling, even back then in the ancient past. Now, another thing to think about is that when we're reading these ancient poems, you shouldn't try to memorize every single detail of the story. That's not what not what I'm asking you to do. Instead, let your mind absorb what you're seeing and imagine that you're living back there in that culture around 1200 BC in the Punjab. Right? Try and imagine what it might have been like to have been at one of these sacrificial sessions, these Soma parties, right? Where the Rigveda poems were being recited and where these myths would have had like a serious cultural impact. I kind of like to imagine these sessions as being analogous maybe to rap concerts. Often the lyrics that are being spit out are kind of obscure and hard to understand and figure out, but the beat is dope, right? And the whole thing serves to help us think about our own place in the world. Now, also while we're reading them, keep in mind our thematic topics and see if they pop up in your stories. Identity, truth, power, violence, trauma, death. I think they might. Another thing I wanted to mention is that there have been a lot of mythologists over the years who have looked at the myths of the Rigveda and expounded on various theories about them, a lot of them which I feel are kind of speculative. There's Joseph Campbell, you might have heard of, and Carl Jung, and their approach that treated all myths, no matter what culture they came from, and no matter how long ago they were composed. They said that all myths reflect some kind of universal set of psychological archetypes that we all just kind of carry around in our brains. Another group of scholars, known as the Indo-Europeanists, they saw the myths as that were found in the Veda as being an artifact of an earlier, original Indo-European mythology that was made back in the Aryan homeland or whatever, from a time and place long before the Aryans came to India and when the Rigveda was actually composed. Now, both of these methods may have their merits, but as for me, I have to confess that I kind of resist reading texts totally out of their historical context. In my opinion, the Vedic poets were just like any other poets, like rappers even. They were born and they lived and they died in a particular time and place, and they were writing to impact that particular time and place. That's the way I see it. The value of reading the Rigveda in this kind of historical way, I think, allows us to ask what the Vedic myths might have been doing for the communities that actually cared about them, for whom the myths mattered. In the Punjab and the upper Gangetic plains from around 1500 to 1200 BC. If we can situate a text in its historical context, then we can start to get a better sense of what the poets themselves were kind of aspiring to accomplish in putting together these kind of masterpieces of early Hindu religious poetry. So here's how I think we can go about it. In segment 1, we'll go over some of the facts and details about the Rigveda as a text. In segment 2, we'll get into the kind of bird's eye view of the Vedic pantheon, all the different gods and goddesses that populate the Rigveda. In the third segment, we'll start looking at specific myths about 3 different deities in particular. Segment 3, we'll look at the myths of Indra, who's the most important deity, the most prominent deity in the Rigveda. Then we'll look at Agni in segment 4, who's kind of like the workhorse of the Vedic fire ritual complex. And then in the final segment, we'll finish up with Soma, who's both a god and that stimulating drink. And so he was really an essential part of Vedic life. I'm looking forward to hearing what you think about all of these myths and what they might have meant back then and there, maybe what they mean, what they remind you of today, analogically in our world. Just like anything else from this time period so long ago in India, your guess is basically as good as mine or as good as the scholars. It's really hard to understand. So, see you in a bit.